will speak Mr. Jeremy Corbyn. He's with us. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your time.
Good afternoon. It's lovely to see you and to talk to you all.
The time is yours. Go on.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. I didn't realize that. First of all, thank you for inviting me. And my regret is that I'm in North London, not in Istanbul at the present time. But I'm sure for a future meeting, we'll be able to meet physically together, hopefully in Istanbul. So I thank you for that. What I want to do is talk you through what we did for the Gaza Tribunal that we held. The background to it was that I proposed a private member's bill in Parliament to require the government to establish an independent commission of inquiry into British policy in relation to Gaza, and in particular in relation to the sale of arms and weapons to Israel, which had contributed to the horrible events and the genocide that took place in Gaza. This bill managed to get past its first stage in Parliament, but didn't get beyond that. It was blocked beyond that. And so I thought, well, either we can just leave it there and do something else, or we could indeed establish our own independent inquiry, which is exactly what we did. So we set up our own independent tribunal of inquiry, which met for 2 days in September, and we took witness statements from 29 people. And I was joined as one of the 3 assessors to it by Professor Niamh Gordon from Queen Mary University and Dr. Shah Hammouri from the University of Kent. So you had one Jewish American and one Palestinian in exile as the assessors with me. And we divided the tribunal into 4 sections. Part 1, we discussed what has actually happened in Gaza. So we heard from survivors, from witnesses about the scale of the human suffering, the devastation and the destruction that had taken place in Gaza. 2 of our witnesses were very, very powerful witnesses indeed, both very experienced medical practitioners, doctors, Dr. Nick Maynard and Dr. Victoria Rose. They gave us testimonies of their own experience in Gaza, operating on obviously very badly injured people, many of whom were children, in hospitals that were being bombed at that very time, and hoping to carry on with their work and their operations despite the bombardment that was going on. And the lack of medicines, the lack of water, the lack of electric power, and even the lack of anesthetics or antiseptics in order to treat people. Yet they carried on doing their work. Now, I've known many, many doctors over the years, and doctors are quite hard-bitten. They see life and death very close up every day. But I've never seen 2 doctors more emotionally connected to their patients than Nick and Victoria in the way that they do things. And they don't have to do this, but they both try to go back into Gaza. And all the time when they're not in Gaza, when they're mainly in the UK, they spend their energy and time campaigning and talking about the issue of the Palestinian people. So I think it's to those medical practitioners we should all say an enormous thank you. And he went on to say, Nick did, about the way in which Britain is contributing to the suffering in Gaza obviously by the supply of weapons to Israel, although that the government claims is now reducing. But the reality is so many weapons have been supplied to Israel, they can last for a very long time without any fresh supplies. But crucially, their main weapon of war is the F-35 jet. 15% of the components of the F-35 jet are made at factories in Britain, in Newcastle, in Sheffield, and in some other places around the country. We also heard from Declassified UK, from John McAvoy. He's the chief reporter of Declassified. This is an independent media outlet that, as its name suggests, tries to expose truths that are going on that governments don't want exposed. And he was able to reveal that the UK, Britain, is training Israeli soldiers. Not a huge number, but they are training them. And the Ministry of Defence has tried to assure us in Parliament that they're being trained in military and human rights values in what they do. So I asked myself this question. Israel has been condemned in the Fourth Geneva Convention, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, and many, many other independent human rights bodies around the world. And yet Britain is training their soldiers. It is absolutely outrageous, which then brings into question what they're actually doing and what the effects of all the Israeli soldiers' actions have been. So we had evidence put from Dr. Raz Segal, a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies from the United States. And he described in some detail what the law on genocide is, the genesis of that law, how it came about, and what would constitute genocide, which is an act of attacking and trying to destroy a particular group of people. Hence the description of the Palestinian people as a group of people that are being attacked with genocidal intent. You could say the same with what happened in Darfur. You could say the same with what happened in Cambodia. You could say the same with what happened in Rwanda. And historically, you could say the same about the European invasion of Central America. And there are many, many other colonial examples around the world. And he, and I quote, said that Gaza is a textbook case of genocide. And so we were hearing all this evidence, but I was concerned that we were not necessarily hearing a sufficient number of Palestinian voices. And so we had a student called Abu Bakr Abed, who is a wonderful young man from Gaza who has received a scholarship from the Irish government to study sports media in Dublin, in the university in Dublin. And he came to London to give evidence. And his was very, very powerful, describing what happened to him, what happened to his family. And bear in mind that he wouldn't mind me saying this, has a sort of guilt of being outside Gaza because all his family are still there. And he's obviously concerned for them, their safety, and their future. So he feels it's his duty and his responsibility to work very hard and study very hard. And so he asked us to support the call for a sporting boycott of Israel. And that's where the current dispute about Maccabi Tel Aviv playing against Aston Villa in Britain has become such a big issue. But he also said, and he's somebody that studies the media a great deal, and he's now doing university studies on it, that the British media had actually been complicit in the genocide in Gaza by their failure to report many of the details. And indeed, the failure of most British news organisations to even have a journalist in Gaza. They're relying almost entirely on independent journalists in Gaza, several hundred of whom have been murdered by the Israeli forces, yet nevertheless carry on. They, to me, are real journalists and the real hero of the situation. They've stayed there, done all they could, and carried on doing that reporting, knowing full well that the Israeli Defense Force targets journalists in all of its activities. And so he set this out in a very personal way. And this is a young man who has been starved, basically, for most of the past 2 years. He's a very fit guy. He's a footballer. but he said he didn't get anywhere near enough food to sustain any level of physical activity, and he just felt permanently tired and exhausted by the starvation that's been forced upon him. And with the best will in the world, and I hope he does make a full recovery from the trauma of all this, that's going to affect him for a long time. And then I was looking at him thinking, well, he's a strong, fit young man, and he's having trouble coping. What about those that are less young, less strong, and less fit? How do they cope with all of this? This is the brutality of what's going on. We then went into part two. What are Britain's legal responsibilities on this? And so we invited a number of people to come and outline their duties and obligations that are laid down in both domestic and international law. Remember, Britain prides itself by saying it fully supports and observes all aspects of international law. And this is something I hear time and time again by ministers of all parties in the House of Commons. And to deal with this issue and other issues, we're delighted to be joined by Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine. And she chose her words carefully because she is a UN rapporteur, and obviously everything she says is carefully examined and monitored. And what she said, and I quote, "Ministers may be complicit in Israel's war crimes by the supply of weapons, by the supply of intelligence, by the overflying from the Royal Air Force bases in Cyprus, and by the supply of parts for the F-35 jet, which is causing so much devastation." And she then spoke at some length about the way in which other countries are also complicit in Israel's war crimes. And I think we are all very indebted to to Francesca Albanese for the work that she's doing and carries on doing. And I've got huge admiration for her. And we then moved on to part three. What has Britain's role been in the genocide? Now, we framed it that way because solidarity is important, actions are very important, but it's also important that we do things to have the maximum effect within our own societies. So we are a group based in London, Peace and Justice Project. We are obviously have an international outlook, otherwise we wouldn't be doing this, but we have to look at what we can do within our own society. So that's why I want to look at Britain's involvement and see where we can put pressure on. And so we looked at Britain's involvement into the Israeli military operations in Gaza, including the points I made on supply of weapons, surveillance, and the use of RAF bases. And it also became apparent during our tribunal that not only did Britain use the RAF bases in Cyprus to undertake overflying of Gaza, but also apparently from weapons delivery station, and apparently also Israel is able to use it and also use bases in Cyprus. And that is being looked at very, very carefully by the campaign in Cyprus. And indeed, we met people who have been very active on the campaign in Cyprus itself. And I think it's important we do that. And so we looked at the use of the base and the supply of weapons, surveillance, and so on. And then we heard from Mark Smith, a British Foreign Office official, a Mandarin, if you like, Foreign Office staff, who described how many people in the Foreign Office were deeply upset at what the government's policies were, and deeply upset that what they were being asked to say about it all, when they believe, as I suspect all of us do in this event today in Istanbul, that war crimes have been committed and acts of genocide are taking place. And so he has worked in the Middle East arms export licensing assessment for the government, and he described how he was routinely asked to amend his reports on Gaza, and I quote, to make the situation look less bad, including downplaying the number of civilian deaths. And he described how he was told to delay submissions of reports until they could find something more positive to publish about Israel's involvement in Gaza. So here was somebody being told how to write his reports and also to delay publication of them until they could find something positive to say about Israel's involvement in Gaza. And I just quote again from his evidence. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations on the most controversial aspects of our arms sales policy, which will never be seen by the public. And he described that because they were asked not to write things down, asked not to record meetings, asked not to record events discussing with each other, just to basically do everything on an informal basis. This was a practice first adopted by Tony Blair during the Iraq War. And he went on to say how the whistleblowing team who he'd report this to were ignored, as well as other Foreign Office staff. Whistleblowing is a legal right in Britain. There is legislation to provide protection for whistleblowers. These are people that tell uncomfortable truths from within publicly funded and publicly run organizations. And he said how the concerns they raised were completely ignored. And he went on to suggest that it was impossible to see how the UK government was acting legally in its behaviour towards Gaza. We also met the family of Mr. Henderson, who worked in World Central Kitchen and was killed in Gaza. And he was killed by Israeli bombardment. And his lawyers said that they believed that the RAF, Royal Air Force flights that were overflying Gaza, were overflying at the time of his death, the time of his murder by the Israeli forces. And so he asked the RAF, through the Ministry of Defence in London, as a lawyer, if he could have access to their film of the event when Henderson was killed. And you know what? They said, no, you cannot have it. I'd previously asked separately in Parliament if all the film they'd taken of overflying Gaza could be made available to the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. They said no. And they claimed all the film was about releasing hostages and they would only release it to the Israeli government. And so I rest my case that I think the overflying has all been about assisting Israel's military activities in Gaza by giving them a picture of what's going on there. And he was not even, the lawyer was not even allowed to look at the film footage himself. So we have a pretty bad scenario here of an awful lot of other things. We then heard from Matt Kennard, who's a very experienced journalist involved with a group called Palestine Deep Dive and others. He investigated how Britain had shared surveillance data with Israel to support military operations in Gaza. And again, I quote from him, having looked at the evidence, I think Britain's involvement in the genocide crosses the line into participation. The UK government, through its different military and intelligence agency, has been a participant. And we also heard, as Richard Falk is with us today, from him. And I want to say, Richard, thank you very much for taking part and the evidence you put forward and the power of the message you put forward and your consistent message of humanity for the Palestinian people. Last section was on, again, focused on the British participation. Has Britain lived up to its legal obligations? In this section, we analysed the evidence presented to us to conclude whether Britain had fulfilled its legal obligations or not, as laid out in both domestic and international law. And remember, point I made earlier, Britain is a signatory to all international legal conventions on genocide, on torture, and so on. Sign up, obviously, UN Universal Declaration, European Declaration, International Criminal Court statutes, and historically to the International Court of Justice, which of course predates all the other UN institutions because it was a product of the League of Nations. And we were wanting to know whether Britain has fulfilled its legal obligations or not. So we heard from Tyre Bally, very respected lawyer, and he said his work from the International Centre for Justice for Palestinians, and he gave a forensic assessment of the whole thing at some length. And his conclusion, this was the last evidence, was that Britain was not only failed to meet its legal obligations, but was actively breaching them. And he's somebody that is extremely well informed and very, very knowledgeable on this, as is, of course, the International Centre for Justice for Palestinians. So what's the conclusion of this? We didn't receive enough evidence that I wanted to be able to listen to on environmental impact, water pollution, and the damage to the future possibility of growing crops in Gaza because of the pollution from asbestos poisoning and much else because of the destruction of so many buildings. And so forensic architects gave us a very thorough examination and study on the way in which buildings have been destroyed in Gaza City and other places. But we've asked for further environmental information, which we've now received from Gaza architects and others. And our conclusion is that the government's legacy will be its complicity on some of the greatest crimes against humanity of our time. We've already discovered, 67,000 bodies in Gaza. Estimates vary as to the number of bodies that are still under the rubble, but it's going to be thousands and thousands and thousands more. And the figures I've just heard are that somebody's been estimating the amount of rubble in Gaza. There are 55 million tons of rubble in Gaza. That's like 2 million tons or more, 10 million tons for each Gaza person of rubble created by the Israeli bombardment. Somebody's got to clear all that away. Somebody has got to process all of that to find bodies and body parts in it. And somewhere along the line, somebody's got to start rebuilding. And just like in Iraq, the government is doing everything it can to protect itself from scrutiny on Iraq. They'll not succeed because our tribunal report will be published very soon. We're just completing the final words of it now. And this will uncover, in my view, the full scale of British complicity in genocide. And will bring about justice for the people of Palestine, ultimately. We can't bring back those that have been murdered in Gaza. We can't turn the clock back on all those children whose lives have been lost, who've suffered lifetime problems of disability and other things brought about by what's happened there. But we can alert the world to what happens when you sell arms to a regime that's committing genocide. You can alert the world to the way in which truth is twisted in order to protect those who know full well that they are actually complicit in breaches of international law. And so our tribunals are very, very important. And I'll just conclude with this. I was in South Africa last month and doing meetings with a lot of people, with Dr. Barghouti and myself, went to a lot of places, spoke at meetings, rallies, and took information and evidence from people. I'm very impressed that South Africa took the case to the International Court of Justice, but also people are saying, well, we need to economically isolate Israel as well, and that's why South Africa should, if it can, and I believe it can, cease the supply of coal to Israel. It's not a huge amount that's sent, but nevertheless it is symbolic. And so it is about pursuing the BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions, on all this. I also went to Namibia to meet the government of Namibia and have discussions with them, as well as with the ruling party, SWAPO, and with a very wonderful group of people who've been campaigning in support of Palestine in Namibia, and they were extremely impressive. And so I came back with the feeling that there's some very brave people in often very difficult circumstances doing an incredible job, and that's what this tribunal is about. That's what our Gaza Tribunal was about, and that's why all of us have got to work together cooperatively to get the word out there all across the world. The people of Palestine should not have to live under occupation, should not have to suffer genocide, and that those countries that supply weapons to Israel are complicit in the horror story that has been Gaza since October 23.